I think it's fair to say that working the night shift is almost never fun. The hours mess with your body clock, disturb your sleep, and have the knock-on effect that working a day shift also becomes more difficult because you're so dog-tired to begin with. Still, a lot of people do it, not only because it sometimes pays better, but also because it's the only time they can really fit the work around their other commitments and sometimes their other jobs. Certainly, a few of the folks I used to work the night shift with were actually doing the shift as a second job, having already worked hours at another earlier that day. These double workers would come home from the first job, catch a few hours of sleep, and head out for the night shift like zombies, hoping that the evening would be quiet, and perhaps, whilst the boss wasn't looking, they could catch a few hours of sleep in the storeroom or at the drive-through window. But often they wouldn't get the chance, and would instead have to remain, dead on their feet, working for hours on end, praying for the weekend when they could finally rest before beginning the entire routine over again. For me, the earlier commitment was not another job, but school. I was at a university in the town and had classes most days and research to do when I wasn't in class. This meant that much of the day was taken up in the library or in lectures rather than at work. Unfortunately, work had to happen sometime in order for me to be able to pay my rent, so I signed up for the night shifts at a local 24-hour fast food place. Often I would try, like those two job workers, to catch some sleep in the late afternoon before turning up to work, if my lecture schedule would allow it. On many occasions, however, I simply came to work without having rested and went right through. I knew this was bad for me, but as a kid in my early 20s with the stamina of an ox, I figured I could handle it. More than once I went several days, just going between uni and work without ever even seeing my bed, never mind getting to sleep in it. The result was that I was chronically sleep deprived, which I know is something most people will use as an explanation for what I saw. Now, I'm not saying that's not a theory. I'm bright enough to know that lack of sleep can affect people's judgment, that a person suffering from fatigue and prolonged lack of sleep can display the same sorts of behaviors as someone who is severely drunk. I've read of how people who are tired can fail sobriety tests like walking in a straight line, reciting the alphabet, or showing coordination, even if the chemical tests like breathalyzers show no alcohol in their systems. I also know that after several days without sleep, people will sometimes begin to hallucinate. Shadows become longer and more stretched as the eyes become strained, and the brain takes longer to process what it's seeing. The result is that people begin to see movement on the edge of their vision where there is none, or dark shapes that aren't actually there. They can also experience auditory hallucinations, the sounds of whispering or people talking when there's actually nobody around. These symptoms are of prolonged sleep loss. I'm talking 2 or more days with no sleep at all. Once you get to the 3rd or even into the 4th day, the hallucinations can be vivid and quite detailed. I'd been awake for 2 days straight when I saw what I saw. Not long enough for anything that detailed to be a result of sleep deprivation, or for the auditory and visual hallucinations to be syncing up like they did. It wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't a dream, it was real. I'd worked at the drive-thru for around 6 months by the time what happened. In all that time I only ever worked 1 day shift, which was my first ever shift on the job, and that was only so one of the managers could teach me how to strip and clean the boiler properly. Managers didn't tend to stick around for the night shifts. Instead, after around 10:30 p.m, we would have a duty supervisor and around 6 crew members. In theory, the 24-hour opening was supposed to provide for the road that ran up the motorway back to the city. The idea was that people on early shifts or long-distance driving would stop in, and on weekends you'd catch the crowd coming back from the city, who would literally stop their taxi home so they could pick up a burger and some fries to quell their munchies. In practice, this business plan was a disaster. The drive-thru had opened about 2 months before a bypass that directed traffic in completely the opposite direction and made getting into the city and back far easier. That meant that there was no traffic, which meant no customers. All us night workers knew that sooner or later the head office was going to twig that they were not making any money and stopped the round-the-clock opening. But in the meantime, for a company that big, it seemed that a little franchise in Bumfluff County, out in the middle of Nowheresville, wasn't really going to register. The result was that for most of the night, the crew members working would have very little to do. The day shift managers would try to get a hard night's labor out of us by making us do deep cleanse of the ovens and fryers or the seating area, but honestly, if we all worked together, we could have done that in under an hour and a half. After that, there was very little to do. So, we made an arrangement. I'd do my uni work sitting in the main seating area and keep an eye on the place whilst the others, mostly 2 job workers and 3 of them mothers with kids in school, would go in the back and get their heads down. We literally got to the point where we'd set up a bed made out of bread pallets for them to sleep on for a few hours and keep pillows in our lockers. Some people might think I got a raw deal out of this, but to be honest, I liked it. I was happy that the two jobbers actually got some sleep for once, and that I could help make their lives a little easier. I was happy to have a place to study whilst actually being paid for my time reading books, and as for the morality of not putting in a hard day's work, well, that's just stupid. Do you really think those big corporations would give even half a shit if one of the two-job mothers got sick from exhaustion or overwork? No, so I certainly didn't care if they paid them to sleep on the job. If they could work the system to their advantage, good for them, because the system would sure as hell work them given half the chance. Considering the plight of the company, I believe screw them, was my exact response. The only downside to the others dozing in the back whilst I was alone out front was exactly that. I was alone out front. If you've ever visited a fast food chain drive-through during the day, you'll know that the restaurants are often glass-walled, in the sense that on three sides, there are brick corners and supports, but the front and sides of the building are completely sheet glass, to allow people to look inside and see everyone enjoying their meals. In the daytime, the place actually looks quite inviting. At night, the opposite is true, because the lights are on inside, and there are no floodlights or light sources outside, especially as our little unit backed onto the road and the woods. The glass walls become uniform sheets of black. You can see yourself reflected, but beyond that, everything is blank darkness. Sitting alone in the half-light of one of those places, books laid out on the table with darkness on three sides of you can be quite unnerving. In some ways, it makes you feel exposed, like an animal exhibited in a zoo or a museum piece in a glass case. Something about the fact that people could be looking in, but you would not be able to see them, is peculiarly unsettling. Often I would sit there and become distracted by the dark, the way it seemed to press against the window, as if it had weight and was pushing up against the glass in an attempt to get in. Things would get quiet, pin drop quiet, to the point that even turning the page of my textbook sounded like a huge rippling noise. So you can imagine that when another sound, a sound I wasn't used to, suddenly registered out of nowhere, I sat up and took notice. The sound, I recognized at once, was the dull thunk of someone knocking on the glass. Raising my head, I looked at each of the three glass walls in turn. Still, I could see nothing but my own reflection. Reluctantly, I got up from where I'd been sitting and paced slowly over toward the window and peered out. Looking through my own image reflected back at me, I could just make out the car park outside, but nobody who might have knocked. Moving back to where I'd left my books, I planned to ignore the sound. Probably the wind, I thought, until, with my back turned to the glass, I heard a voice. Speaking in a low, soft tone, it said, "Can I come in?" Now this might not sound like much. Someone, probably drunk, stumbling up to the drive-thru thinking they can come into the main restaurant. No big deal. But you see, the problem wasn't with the voice itself, it was with where the voice was coming from. You see, it wasn't outside, not behind the glass, somewhere out in the car park or in the back room, but directly by my ear, speaking gently, softly and so close that I could feel the speaker's breath raise the hair on my neck. The voice was behind me. I span around in fright to find nothing but the blank dark glass looking back at me. Stepping back, I called to the others, trying to rouse them and see whether it might have been one of them playing a joke. It wasn't. I know this because none of them were in that room when what happened next happened. None of them were there and none of them saw it, but I did. From my position, standing by one of the family booths, I watched as from out of the darkness, a face appeared at the window. It was a man's face. A man with snow-white hair and skin so pale, it looked almost as grey and cold as the tabletops on which I had been working. At first, the face was inches from the surface of the glass, but then it wasn't. As I watched, wordlessly observing, the face pressed against the window, smooshing the cheek and chin against the glass so that it squished and folded up, spreading out wide, pushing forward and pressing against the glass with such force that the nose and the ridge of his eyebrow had flattened out too, painfully stretched as it strained against the surface. There was nobody visible, no hands also pushing, no shoulder or even neck, just a face pushing against the glass. For a moment I worried that this constant pressing might crack the glass and was about to tell this guy to stop. But then, as I watched on dumbfounded, the face came through it. The glass did not break. There was no crack or splintering to shards. The surface remained intact. Yet this head, this old withered face, disembodied and unconnected to any form of a body, passed slowly as if melting through the solid surface. The face came through the glass. I ran, out of the back exit and out onto the road. I didn't wait to pick up my books, my regular clothes, or even my bag. My things were passed to me a few days later by one of my colleagues. I have never been back. I reported what I saw to the managers via telephone and sent an email to the franchise head office telling them about the incident and how I didn't think it was safe for people to be working there at night. A week later, the 24-hour opening was cancelled. Night workers were either made redundant or swapped to another unit. Night shifts at this place were suddenly a thing of the past. In a statement, the company said that the new bypass had diverted traffic and that they were restructuring their business model. There was no mention of a face at the glass or any other reason why the night shift might have so suddenly come to an end. But there was an investigation, during which CCTV footage from both inside and outside the unit was examined. That footage has since disappeared.